That was another thing. That was another thing that caused some concern.
Sorry about that. I think when it my everything cut out for a second, and when it came back on, I think it had stopped the recording for a second, but I think we're going again. Sorry about
Okay.
that. All
Oh,
right.
no problem. No problem. So, Einstein's approach of this observer first or positivistic approach to physics that was inspired by Mach, uh, interestingly, when the quantum pioneers started trying to interpret and understand quantum physics, they were influenced by Mach through Einstein. When Heisenberg gave his first talk in Berlin on the new quantum theory he had developed, Einstein invited him back to his apartment for a discussion after the talk. And Heisenberg related this in Physics and Beyond, that only came out in like 1970, so 15 years or so after Einstein's death. But what he said was that Einstein had complained that there weren't any electron trajectories in Heisenberg's approach to quantum mechanics. He was just dealing with the initial state and the final state, and there was no description of what happens in between those two states. And Heisenberg basically quoted Einstein and Einstein's work in relativity right back at him, saying that he only focused on what was observed. He didn't deal with these superfluous questions of the processes or the mechanisms or what really happened, only focusing in a Machian sense on the measurements and the data and not concerning himself with what was going on in between. So it was really kind of putting the shoe on the other foot for Einstein. He was very uncomfortable with that. One of the other big influences on Einstein was I guess, Dutch philosopher of Portuguese Jewish extraction, Spinoza. And Spinoza emphasized the causal connectedness of reality, that even though we don't necessarily understand how everything is working, everything is tied together. There are cause and effect relationships that pervade the universe. So what we see is, as modern physics progressed into quantum mechanics, Einstein was kind of left behind. He'd kicked off the process with his observer-first Machian approach to relativity, but he became increasingly uncomfortable on that, taking a more Spinoza-like approach, arguing that God does not play dice with the universe. And his objections culminated ultimately in a very famous paper called the EPR paper, after the authors Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen, where Einstein and his co-authors argued that quantum mechanics has to be incomplete. And I think that's still now his most cited paper and is really fundamental to many of the questions that we look at in quantum physics regarding hidden variables and quantum entanglement and subjects along those lines.
Okay.
So that's the summary of how the modern physics works. And I could kind of take it from there, if you'd like to talk about some of the conflicts I guess we probably want to talk about the Rockefeller Foundation and their role in this process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let me go ahead and do that. The Rockefeller Foundation, in the wake of World War I, they had already been funding a lot of initiatives on medicine and medical education.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they decided to expand their mandate into science and biology, and in particular, funding physics. So they made very large grants trying to set up institutions that would enable these advances in science and make connections between scientists. They funded programs, for instance, at Caltech that really made Caltech the science powerhouse that it is today. They funded the University of Chicago. They made a lot of other smaller grants to different institutions. And the one that really caught my eye is they were one of the principal founders or funders of the Copenhagen Institute in Denmark. That's where Niels Bohr, was the head of that and the teacher who kicked that off. And Bohr was extremely influential. Murray Gell-Mann, who was a Nobel Prize winning particle physicist, commented that Niels Bohr had brainwashed a generation of physicists with his Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Basically, he had argued that there is a wave function that pervades the experimental space, and only on the act of measurement does the wave function collapse, and we have a particle detected in a particular place, for instance. Okay. So it was, again, a very Machian observer first approach to understanding reality. And Bohr was enabled to proselytize and promote his idea because the Rockefeller Foundation paid to send a great many American graduate students and postdocs to Denmark to study under him.
So was the Copenhagen Institute, was that sort of the badge or the seal of I ask because I'm not as familiar with obviously the science education world, but you're talking about the Rockefellers, and what I do know is at that exact same time, and it's John D. Specifically, the Rockefeller Foundation is, we've talked about it a couple times, but all through the 1800s and up into right around the turn of the century, I mean, you would go to either an herb doctor or a homeopathic doctor, or you would go to, what we consider a traditional medicine now, but it was pretty new then. And with that came petroleum-based pharmaceuticals. And the Rockefellers, being a big oil family, they threw all their weight behind that style of medicine. And basically, by creating, my question was going to be, are there any governing bodies of science? I don't know exactly how that works, but that they might have put their hands in, because I know they went from, this country and the world really went from, like, you basically went to the doctor who suited your illness. If it was this, you'd usually go see an herb doctor, or you deal with homeopathy for this other thing. And then obviously you're going to want some morphine or whatever for, pharmaceuticals for specific things. But at a certain point through Johns Hopkins, they threw all their weight and their influence behind making that that was the route. And then the other forms went away, and they did a similar thing with history. And they got so involved in the Rockefeller Foundation got so involved in history, not only in this country, but in England as well. And in particular, writing the textbooks and the funding with these huge grants to colleges, to where they had quasi control of the curriculum, the same way they did with, and I don't remember what governing body it was, but it was the governing body for the medical world. They dumped all their money into that, and then petroleum-based pharmaceutical medicine became, and it was on the outside, just looking into it a little bit, it seems like, oh, these guys are huge philanthropists, and they wanted to support medicine and doctors and better care for people. But then you see the way that they did it on the history side of things, and a lot of the history that was lost because didn't make it into their textbooks and their curriculums. And then what really hits me with the Rockefellers is, and I don't know that a ton of people know about this. Well, I mean, enough. If you're like me, you do, but they did a very similar thing with prohibition. no, the temperance movement had been around since the 1800s. There had been people begging the government and their local leaders to basically get their husbands to stop drinking so much, because that's what everybody drank. In a lot of cases, the booze in town was cleaner than the water. And so, we drank a preposterous amount of alcohol, not only in America, but the world. And temperance movement had been around for a long time. And this is, I'm hijacking the conversation, but I think it it's incredible how one family, regardless of how much money, how genius and somewhat nefarious it is, they, at a certain point after automobiles were kind of created around this same time, um, uh, farmers started getting motorized farm equipment. And very shortly thereafter, they realized, oh, we don't have to buy gas for our motorized farm equipment. We can take all of our scraps, our organic scraps and things that we have from the farm, and we can distill those and ferment those and create our own fuel. And so, yeah, there was mountain men making moonshine to get hammered on, but a lot of farmers had stills on their property at that time to produce a alcohol that could be put into tractors and Model Ts and whatnot. And right around that time is when the Rockefellers step in, dump millions into the temperance movement, create all this propaganda because of their influence with newspapers and politicians and whatnot. And then overnight, we have one of the craziest, like, I don't know. I'm sober, but like the decision to make it illegal for everyone in the country to not consume alcohol is crazy. And it at least seems like a little bit of that was to get all that petroleum based gasoline that they had just started booming with the advent of the automobile market. It started to get curtailed by some farmers, and they couldn't even handle that. And so they put the kibosh on alcohol. And when you start getting into the Rockefellers, and I've never even heard of their influence into like physics and things like that, but in some way, shape, or form, I have to believe, because of the way they inserted themselves in every other field, that they weren't just big fans of science, and this was a self-serving thing. And so that was a really long way around saying, or asking, did you find any connections to like governing bodies where it wasn't they were just shoving money in so that people could learn this narrative, but did they have their hooks into what you could learn, and what kind of the way they did with medicine and booze? And
Well, I am familiar. I haven't really looked into this myself. I'm familiar with a claim or an argument that they were responsible for classifying oil and petroleum as being biotic, as being fossil fuels, in contrast to the notion that they might be abiotic and produced by natural geophysical processes deep within the earth, and that was done to further the impression that they were a more limited resource. And of course, that kind of ties into the whole what's now the neo-Malthusian limits of growth
right,
mentality that's furthering totalitarian government
it's kind of
control.
scarcity
Right.
narrative, to where we all have to switch to also an equally, if not worse, more pollutant filled industry like electric cars, considering the mining and because gas is going to run out.
Right.
And Bernays, when you throw Bernays into the mix, and I know you're going to talk about that, so I don't want to steal your thunder there, but it's this propagandizing of a narrative that, God, this one family that had so much control I mean, I mean, it's incredible. You create after we've talked about this before, after a generation, you just tell one lie. And if you have enough influence, it only takes about a generation for that to be biblical. You know what I mean? Like it's fossil fuels. It comes from dinosaurs. No, it doesn't. Or even plants. Like, so it's limited. Um,
What does Bernaise sauce have to do with anything? That's what I wanted to know.
well, it's
I know
delicious.
you're a chef, but
It's delicious. No, I felt like you were getting close to that, Hans. But keep going if you weren't.
Sure. Well, I looked into. I really haven't finished my investigations. I was kind of hoping you guys might also have some insights that would help me on this, because what was clearly happening is the Rockefeller Foundation was putting a lot of money into funding physics institutions, a lot of money into paying for fellowships to send Americans abroad to study. It certainly contributed to a centralization and internationalization of science. I didn't see any, or at least I haven't come across any evidence of particular agendas. You know, I haven't seen that
Yeah.
they particularly wanted to influence or to support the Copenhagen interpretation versus alternate explanations or theories of quantum mechanics. But certainly their efforts did contribute to further globalization of and internationalization of science.
Now I know ether is in your you know, well, we won't say that, but could you quickly, because I'm gonna have a follow-up question. Could you quickly give us the dummy version of what ether is and how it's different? Because ether is a bit of an old world idea that has started to come back kind of in the truther and alternate media. But if I'm correct, at a certain point, ether was kind of poo-pooed and like um and it became fringe at a certain point, correct? And so
Yes.
and my so I would like to get a little bit better understanding. I think a lot of people would, the difference between ether and science, you know, science with ether and then science minus ether. And
Sure.
then what I'm curious about and what would be interesting to look in is, you know, those American physicists and scientists who were given that money, if you know, whether it be ether or anything else that might have been kind of been swept under the rug, how many of those people who were given that money by, you know, or those opportunities by the Rockefellers, how many of them towed the main line of this narrative, you know, and then how many may have not gotten those same opportunities who were quote unquote fringe or what was becoming more fringe, you know?
Well,
Was,
they ended up funding a broad range of mainstream physicists, and I really only became aware of this as I was reading the biographies and doing research for my book, where I'd be reading about a random physicist that would talk about their Rockefeller Foundation fellowship that let them study in Europe, and it kept popping up again and again and again and again, which is what led me to the history of the Rockefeller Foundation by Fosdick, which was written in
okay.
the early 50s and has a very good and comprehensive discussion of the funding
Okay.
efforts. It's not, I mean, there are some things that are omitted. For instance, the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, that was not funded by the Rockefellers. It was funded by another heir, I guess an heir who'd sold just before the stock market crashed and had a lot of money and wanted to set up an educational institute. But someone affiliated with the Rockefeller Foundation facilitated their creation of this Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, which of course is ultimately where Einstein ended up.
Right.
So they had their hands in other, or Rockefeller Foundation principals had their hands in other projects like this, even though they weren't directly funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. But let me back up and answer your question about ether.
Okay.
Isaac Newton had advocated a theory of light and optics that was material or particle based. And for a long time, the conventional wisdom was to think of light as being some kind of particle moving through space. That was reinforced by all the interpretations of Newtonian mechanics that treated reality as being kind of atoms in a void as our model of reality, little point particles interacting through force laws at a distance. Well, Thomas Young and Fresnel developed, Augustin Fresnel in France developed the wave theory of light. And as it became clear that light had interference and diffraction properties that were associated with wave-like behavior, the natural question is, well, waves in what? And the answer to that question was to hypothesize this medium, the ether, that somehow supported light as it moved from place to place. And as Maxwell came up with his laws of electromagnetism in the 1860s, he was able to make the connection between light and electricity and magnetism and describe how light was an electromagnetic wave. And that led to a general acceptance of, well, if we've got these waves, there has to be a process. And that process is these waves propagate through an ether of some kind. That's the material medium that causes this propagation. Now, the first, or that supports or enables that propagation. And when Heinrich Hertz did his experiments, he basically caught energy in the act of moving from place to place. So you'd have a transmitter, and then the energy would move to a receiver, and he was able to pick it up any place in between, developing standing waves. It was very clear at that point that the waves moved through a medium, that you could have standing waves with concentrations of energy in the medium. And I mean, there had to be something that was supporting that energy in otherwise seemingly empty space. So that's what led to a great conviction of the existence of the ether. Well, as I mentioned about Einstein's approach, because he focused only on what was observationally seen, on what an observer would see or perceive, he regarded the ether as being superfluous. I mean, why do we need to talk about a mechanism? It just happens, and we've got the math, and we know how to describe it, and let's go forward from there. And that became the standard accepted wisdom in physics. Now, ironically, in 1920, about the same time these anti-relativity reactions or meetings were kicking off, Einstein accepted a position as a visiting professor in Belgium at university in Leiden, which was where Lorentz was. And Lorentz had long been an enthusiast of this ether theory. So when Einstein gave his inaugural address, he explained how general relativity could be thought of as coexisting with an ether, that somehow space had these properties of curvature, and that meant it had these material properties. He proposed kind of a geometric gravitational ether as a foundation for general relativity. That didn't really catch on, and most physicists from about the time of the general relativity forward had rejected the notion of an ether. It couldn't be directly observed. It was kind of a placeholder for unknown, mysterious processes that may be responsible for light propagating from place to place. So, they rejected it from their physics and didn't think in terms of trying to understand the fundamental process or how it works.
Did it just go away at that point? I mean, because like I said, after a generation, so many things are just pushed to the side because that's not what's being pushed.
Yeah, it did largely go away. And that's why in physics today, consideration of an ether is largely considered a more of a fringe theory. Now,
And what's the replacement for the ether? Is there, or did they just go, nope, we can't see it, and we've got these statistics and results, and we're past that because we know what happens at the end?
the replacement is what I refer to as the shut up and calculate model of physics.
Right. So we can get to the end product. We don't need to understand what's in between.
Exactly.
That seems so crazy and so similar to Clovis first, or the idea that in America the Clovis culture was the first culture, and then they find stuff from before the Clovis culture, and it's like, no, we have it. Or the pyramids, where there is this theory of when they were built, and there's an entire science built on what the pyramids are, who built them, how they built them, and no matter what kind of evidence comes to the contrary, it's not only not considered, it's shit all over, like it's dumb. And these are brilliant people doing this research, and credentialed people, and that part of any of the sciences or fields has always blown me away, and what makes me interested in conspiracy and hidden history and whatnot, because there is this tendency to just skip over the difficult part and say we got the answer. But I think that's what gets us into so much trouble. I think understanding that middle part is what could probably save us a lot of like heartache, that results from some of these advancements and whatnot. Anyway, those are
Is there not a question though of what is the ultimate goal of finding out? I would think there are some questions where knowing that doesn't necessarily make any difference, because what you're trying to figure out is to get you to some other point. And in some cases, knowing something before is irrelevant if you have a certain piece later in the chain, if that makes any sense.
That's
so my idea on that is that's kind of like, for us, I would say, me and you, Daniel, talking about physics. Yeah. They've got the end result, and we can pretty much, me and you can pretty much go, yeah, okay, they're there now. We don't need to know necessarily. But the people in that field to have that big chunk, it'd be like, it's kind of like today, mechanics. They've got those, those code readers and whatnot, where they can just plug a code reader into the computer of a car,
and you
and
get
go,
the code, and you know what's wrong, and you know what to fix.
You know what's wrong. Now, when you're on the side of the road, when that specific mechanic, and I know my dad was a mechanic, and he knows mechanics like this, and I know mechanics like this, literal mechanics who do this for a living, their car breaks down on the side of the road, and without that stupid computer, they have to call somebody with a computer. Whereas, my pops, old school, you know what I mean? Like dirty knuckle mechanic, he pulls over on the side of the road and fixes people's cars for him. You know what I mean? Because he has that knowledge. I think there's within the field and the experts in those fields, and I'm a dummy. I don't know, but I saw the same thing with chefs. You know what I mean?
I was gonna make a chef comparison, but I think you're on the right track there. Maybe this is something that Hans can talk about as well, for those who are not super into physics. So, but when you're talking about Einstein and the theory of relativity and where it comes from and the existence of an ether or what replaces it, what is it trying to solve, and what is the benefit of knowing? Because that, in my mind, is what makes a difference, whether it's important to know if there's an ether or what the particles are traveling in or on or supported by. That's really the question. What are you trying to do with it?
And that is a very good question. We can fall back to a science where we have a little better picture of what's going on. That would be chemistry. Richard Feynman observed that at one point, where if you wanted to condense the most scientific knowledge into the least amount of words, what you would do is you would say all matter is made of atoms. Because by doing that, if you understand that basic fundamental principle, all of chemistry starts to make sense. You can understand why its specific ratios of why it's always 2 atoms of hydrogen to 1 atom of oxygen, why you get all of these regularities in the atomic masses, in chemical behavior, and so forth. Now, the where physics is today is at kind of at the state of chemistry before we had atomic theory. We've got a lot of understanding of what happens. We know how to predict equations. We know when we do certain things what the outcomes will be and how to predict them, but we don't have an understanding of how or why it works. And when you can get that kind of understanding, you can make the subject much simpler. It's no longer a bunch of disconnected observations. It has what Whewell would call, I think it was Whewell, would call consilience. Everything sticks together better. There's a central organizing principle of it. I think that in physics, ether can serve that purpose. It's really, the way I treat ether is it is an acknowledgement that there is some process, some physical mechanism by which electromagnetism works. And I don't pretend to define exactly what that process is, but I've been deeply influenced in my own work by reading the Maxwellians, Maxwell's successors, people like Heaviside and like Hertz, and Maxwell himself, who had a conviction that energy was stored in space somehow. That picture of reality is fundamental to our understanding, for instance, of how antennas work. A lot of physicists, when they deal with electromagnetism, they assume that they're just looking at transmission and reception, that one atom releases a photon and another atom absorbs it. There's even a formalization of that called the transactional theory of interactions. So it's only focused on the act of transmission and the act of reception, and what happens in between gets ignored. Now, from an antenna engineer point of view, we don't think that way. We look at a transmitter, and we know that if we take our receiver, we can move it anywhere around that transmitter, and wherever we go, we will see the signal fall off as 1 over r squared. We will see the signal strength has a particular angular dependence, depending on the pattern of our transmit antenna and the pattern of our receive antenna. It becomes very clear, the model that makes sense when you look at it from that practical or applied perspective is that the fields and the energy exist in space, and we're just using our receive antenna to tap into them at a particular point and measure what's going on and measure the properties of the ether and the energy in it around that transmit antenna.
Does
so
this
yeah,
I was gonna say this, and forgive me if I'm way off, but does this tie into what Tesla was doing? Is that the ether was a part of his?
Tesla is a very interesting character because, of course, our modern electrical system and alternating current electricity depends in large part on his brilliant contributions, coming up with things like 3-phase current and doing his work on electric motors and so forth. But he had some very strange ideas when it came to radio waves and transferring electromagnetic energy. If you take a look at his original patent for that the Supreme Court ultimately ruled was the patent governing the pioneering discovery of radio waves. If you look at the original version, Tesla's scheme was to generate extremely high voltages to create an arc that would go all the way up high into the atmosphere, into the ionosphere, and create basically a DC path that would then allow you to send telegraph signals or power to any other similar station that had excited a similar path up to the ionosphere. So he was basically talking about creating a connected wired, though the wire was this plasma excitation grid to transmit energy all over the place.
All up in the ionosphere? Is that like crazy dangerous? It feels like in my dummy brain, I feel like he's creating high voltage and just shooting it across like the,
I don't know. In principle, maybe you could get that to work, but it's highly impractical.
Okay.
But what he did was, not long thereafter, he filed a continuation where he noted that his same apparatus could be used to transmit energy more in the same way that Marconi had done. Now, Tesla always emphasized the importance of having a connection to earth ground that Marconi did not always have. And that part of that is a question of frequencies. Tesla was always working with relatively low frequencies. He tried to create surface waves, for instance, to send power from place to place, where Marconi was explicitly looking more at free space electromagnetic waves. But Tesla, I think, is overrated. I mean, there may be some clever concepts in many of the things that he did, but his fundamental approach to how electromagnetism works doesn't square up with what we understand today and the many applications that we've come up with for it.
Okay.
Fun fact, Tesla was Croatian, or the Croatians claim him anyway. But where he was born was part of Croatia at some point.
Was he Croatian or
That's
Serbian?
That's what the Croatians say. Well, that is one of many disputes the two have. I only say the Croatians claim him because I lived there for a while, and they're like, no, he was from Croatia. That village was part of Croatia at the time, and then the Serbs say otherwise, and of course they have lots of issues with each other.
I'm sure that's not an assertion you want to make to a Serbian.
Yeah, it depends on where you are, where you say he's from. And not to totally derail onto something else, but where do you fall on this idea that I've only heard about sort of in passing? I haven't read extensively about it, but this idea that Edison ripped off Tesla and all of that stuff. Are you familiar with all of that?
I am familiar with it. I've seen conflicting views on that. I mean, the conventional wisdom. One story is that Edison had promised Tesla a great reward if he solved this particularly tricky problem, and I don't remember all the details now. Tesla solved it and presented it to Edison, and Edison said, "Oh, I was just kidding," and refused to pay him, leading to Tesla going out on his own. I think ultimately, certainly Tesla and Westinghouse won the battle of the currents, and AC emerged triumphant over DC. So I don't think Edison was working on DC. He may have taken advantage of Tesla while Tesla was in his employ, but the bulk of that battle was fought after Tesla had left Edison and was busy working with Westinghouse and General Electric on AC electrification.
I believe, and I don't remember which family it was, but I do remember a big old school family. It might have been the Rockefellers, I don't know, but I know a family like that were big Edison backers, and I can't remember who it is, so it's probably no use in even saying that. But
well, thanks for wasting our time then. If you can't
that's
remember
what I do.
who it was.
That's what I do. I give theories and cite no sources.
Well, right. You mentioned a couple people. Was Lorenz. He was Austrian, right? Lorenz.
Lorenz was Dutch.
He was Dutch, and Heisenberg isn't Heisenberg. This is one of those fun fact, popular entertainment things. But isn't Heisenberg the one that what's his name in Breaking Bad?
Yes.
chose for his code name was after
Yes.
that same Heisenberg. Yeah,
Right.
that's funny.
Well, and that's one of the interesting things that, to my mind, the the story of modern physics and relativity and quantum mechanics is the story of how an Austrian Mach and how a Frenchman, Poincaré, how their ideas were put together by Einstein, who was a German Jew, to create relativity. Now, Niels Bohr was half Jewish and contributed to quantum mechanics. And a lot of Einstein's critics and critics of quantum mechanics dismissed it as Jewish physics
Hmm.
because of Einstein's role, because of Niels Bohr's role. But yeah, ironically, really, the fundamental philosophic premise of it was from the Austrian German Mach, and it's very interesting to see how much of it came from the German natural philosophy of Goethe. You can read what Heisenberg had to say, and he explicitly quoted Goethe and Goethe's play Faust.
Hmm.
And at one point in the play, Faust is lecturing, or Mephistopheles is lecturing Faust and telling him about lacing his mind in Spanish boots to stay on the narrow track of logic and not go chasing ideas, hither and yon. The Spanish boots being the torture instrument that was clamped to people's feet by the Inquisition
Hmm.
to try to extract a confession out of them. And Heisenberg commented, the conclusion that Goethe had there, that you shouldn't narrowly constrict your logic and reason in a straitjacket, because that's the death of innovation and creativity. And I was really surprised to see that same phrase pop up in something another prominent German scientist, Walter Nernst, wrote about not lacing the spirit in Spanish boots and believing in strict causality. That was part of his justification for the acausal, random, statistical interpretation of quantum mechanics, and how quantum mechanics was taken to support this statistical acausal, things just kind of happen randomly approach to reality. And what's interesting when you look into it is how that philosophic preconception really predated the development of quantum mechanics. I mean, the conventional wisdom, the conventional story is that physicists pursued a classical causal interpretation of reality until the emerging discoveries of quantum mechanics forced them to renounce their cherished premises and adopt the idea that everything is random and acausal. And that's complete nonsense. You can trace back, in the early 20s, long before the critical quantum mechanical discoveries, how all of these scientists were explicitly expressing ideas that advocated the acausal philosophy. And that was the philosophic premise through which all
Hmm.
these emerging discoveries in atomic physics were developed. The premier advocate of that analysis and that notion in history is a gentleman named Paul Foreman. Sometimes it's called the Foreman thesis of the history of quantum mechanics. I think he makes a very convincing case for that thesis.
Well, that kind of brings me back to slightly earlier question that I don't know that we got to the end of. Well, maybe I didn't phrase it the right, but when we're talking about this ether question and what you're trying to solve with physics, what is it that people are trying to solve for?
Well, I
And
can
I mean
talk.
that like very broadly and philosophically, because you're not trying to figure out the way things work for the sake of the way things work, you know.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do.
But there's got to be the way things work leads to the next thing, to the next thing. Ultimately, I think there's always a broader philosophical question there, though, right? I mean, you want to know how things work, but why do you want to know how things work? That's really my
Because knowing
question.
how things works lets you solve more problems.
Hmm.
The more models you have, the more tools you have in your toolbox
Hmm.
as a physicist. I mean, that's another Feynman story that I can share. Feynman had just kind of randomly latched on to this particular obscure method of solving integrals in calculus. And he got a reputation as being a real calculus whiz, because whenever his professional colleagues couldn't solve a problem, they'd use all of the standard methods that everyone had learned to try to solve them. And when they didn't work, they'd come and see Feynman. He had that one trick that no one else knew. And a lot of times he was able to solve what seemed to be an intractable problem because he had that extra trick in his toolbox. So by understanding or developing an understanding of the mechanisms by which electromagnetism works, we gain an extra set of tools for our toolbox that help us understand physical problems and solve them.
So
And I, oh,
isn't
go
the
ahead.
problem though, isn't the problem though what the hell is going on and what's the point? Isn't that really sort of it? It's not like this car drives. I want to know how it drives. You want to know where it's going. Why is there a car? You know,
Well, but if
maybe
you
I'm
know,
not phrasing it the right way, but
if you
I
have
I
feel
think
like
I know what.
that's
questions,
ultimately, I think the real question is like, well, you want to know how the universe works, right? And the
right,
more you
right.
know about it, and you build these tools, and then you find out another little piece, and that unlocks another piece. But you're really trying, everybody is, I think, really, and I don't mean this in a religious sense because I'm not, but personally, but I think really it's trying to determine how
Is
is this
God
all
dead?
working, but why in the world is it working? What is the point of it working at all? And,
Well,
you know,
I, I, if I can,
but
I'd
I'm
like
not a
to.
physicist. I wonder if physicists feel that way, you know.
Well, a lot of physicists explicitly don't feel that way
Hmm.
and regard physics as being a science that strictly deals in the prediction of experiments and in making mathematical models to understand how, what the outcome of an experiment or observation will be. And they would reject on principle notions like, well, is there an ether that's responsible for conveying waves, or how is energy stored in free space? Questions like that about how it works, or what's going on, they would regard as being metaphysical questions that maybe would be suitable for a philosopher to address, but not as appropriate subjects for physicists to concern themselves with.
I'd
So
like to
is
take.
that related to Einstein's thought of I don't care
Daniel,
how it gets from A to B, it doesn't matter what's in the middle?
Well,
Does that
that's
relate
the
because
or am I
that's
reading it
conventional.
wrong?
considered the metaphysical side that it doesn't need to be theorized because you have the end result.
Hmm.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is I'd like to interject some woo woo into this
Oh, here
because
we go.
yeah. Well, and I don't know if I'll explain this appropriately, but
No, the Earth is not flat, Ernie. We've already been over
I
this
don't
a
believe the earth
gazillion
is flat.
times.
But
Okay.
what I do believe is that there's thousands, hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of secret groups and orders all throughout the ages, right? And and that's usually put off as weird culty people who don't who are more concerned about the woo woo than the end product, which is hard science and something that you can actually touch and hold and measure, right? But when you really look into who's at the top of some of these woo woo organizations, what you find is a whole lot of people who dump a bunch of money in grants to push the narrative of whatever it is, your Rockefellers and things. They are part of these passed down mystery schools and things like that. So on one hand, they're telling the world you don't need to know about what's in the middle. We're giving you the end result, right? But at the same time, they are obsessed with what's in the middle. The entire reasoning behind Freemasonry and the ancient mystery schools and Ordo Templo Orientis and all those things where these brilliant minds would come together and practice magic. I mean, that's something that I don't think people really grasp. Is some of the most brilliant minds in history did hard science, and then they did crazy woo-woo stuff. You know what I mean?
Well,
And
weren't we talking about a couple episodes ago? Newton was one of those, right?
Yeah, I
Newton
was
did a
about to
bunch of
mention
weird
Newton.
stuff, and
right,
Yeah.
but he had to shut up about a lot of it because it wasn't good for him. And that's because I think that there is power, really serious and probably tangible power in the in between, right? They don't want you to have the big they don't want the normal, the proletariat, the profane to have the information that gets you to the tangible measurable thing, right? That's the whole point of these secret orders and whatnot, is to pass down the underlying science, that middle part of the sandwich. You know what I mean? That's, I mean, truly, that's what these societies and whatnot are. They're passing down these secrets. How did the pyramids get built? Well, we can't build the pyramids the way with modern technology. So they had something, but you don't need to know about that. You know what I mean? All you need to know is there's the pyramids. They're amazing. It was a feat of incredible. It was an incredible feat by people with copper tools. But and that's a really played out example. But what I'm saying is these mystery schools have gone on forever, and the most wealthy, important, influential people combined with the most brilliant minds on the planet, they care. Like I've heard conspiracy theorists say it a million times. It doesn't matter if you don't believe in it. You know what I mean? They have the
Right.
saying about
They
like
do.
astrology. It doesn't matter that you don't believe in astrology, but just know for sure that Bloomberg and the Rockefellers and the Astors and all those people, they not only believe it, they don't make a move without consulting it. And there's something in that. You know, it's been obscured because we aren't read into the thing. You know what I
you're not
mean? I just
allowed.
petered out there at the end, but I think I made a point that kind of makes sense. I
Well,
do think that middle section is the how is purposefully hidden from us. And like I said,
well,
after a generation, it's you
I
don't even
think
care
that
anymore.
there is a great, Gnosticism has always held a great appeal because a lot of people want to be in possession of secrets that other people don't have. That goes to their self-esteem and self-worth, the knowledge that they are part of the inner elect that understand the deeper mysteries, unlike the common folk. I'm not convinced that you know those deep mysteries are necessarily all that they're cut out to be or are all that valuable. Certainly, a lot of what I understand of the various rituals are just kind of meaningless rituals and systems and processes that I don't think have a lot of you know, validated real world impact. I mean, they may believe in it, and there may be placebo effects. There may be elements of persuasion or mind control associated with it in some of their rituals and practices. But I'm not convinced there's much there. I guess is what I'm.
I think my point is more because I do believe in opposing powers in the universe. However anybody else takes that, I have my own worldview. I think my point is that there's something. I don't see a Leonardo da Vinci, a Newton. I don't see a lot of these guys. Like so many throughout the ages who are so brilliant, wasting their time. I mean, these are polymaths, and they're people who are they're gonna explore everything if they can, because they're the type of people that can read 5 books in a day. But I don't see, to the obsessive extent that some of these guys went through, amassing these preposterously large alchemical. I mean, some of these scientists from the Middle Ages had as many alchemical books as their entire, that rivaled their like hard science kind of libraries and things like that.
Well, I think some of these like the secret organizations do have, I mean, they certainly have a positive impact. If you're a Freemason, you commit to help your brother, and that can be a very positive thing for you in business, making connections and have very positive real world uh, impacts on you. So I don't want to uh, belittle it, but in terms of having secret knowledge, I'm not convinced the secrets are all they're cracked up to be.
Well, yeah,
Because like it might
I
help you
would
become
agree.
president because you know the right people, but it's not going to save you from dying because you know a great secret of the universe or something, maybe.
I get that totally, and I'm there with you for the most part. I just think there's something at some. I just don't see these organizations sticking around. Yeah, they pull in your fish fry community leader Masons with, hey, we're a fraternity and we're gonna do good things in the community. But the further you get up those ladders, yeah, I'm not talking about your city councilman who's like,
Right.
uh,
Well, I think these things are also they're mechanisms for control, and
for sure.
even just the generic fellowship of Freemasonry, because it operates under a veil of secrecy. It provides the ideal forum for people to carry out other
For sure.
conspiracies or other plots behind the scenes and confer and coordinate and relay messages back and forth and so forth. That's part of
And to
the
steer narratives and
yeah, if you
things
look
like
at
that.
like
Yeah.
Robeson's, I think it's Robeson's Proofs of a Conspiracy. He was a Mason who wrote in detail about the Masonic role in the French Revolution and how the
Mm-hmm.
various continental Masonic lodges were involved in the many various conspiracies and counter conspiracies that gave rise to the French Revolution, and then blew it all apart into the terror of
Yeah, that operating system has been in place for, you
right.
know,
So
thousands
there's
of
certainly
years. Yeah.
there's certainly tools of control and tools of coordination that people have used. I don't know if you're familiar with Matt Ehret and his wife Cynthia Chung and their work.
I
They've
don't
been
think
doing
so.
a documentary series lately, The Hidden Hand Behind UFOs, where they've
Oh
done a
yeah.
really nice job creating a documentary going from the mystery cults, the Oracle at
Delphi.
Delphi, and tracing it all the way forward through H.G. Wells. The latest episode is looking specifically at Roswell and the modern UFO phenomenon, and how a lot of that is being driven by government and intelligence uh,
Yeah,
connections.
Hmm.
and let me be clear too. When I was saying woo woo, I wasn't necessarily saying that like these secret societies have like the ability to actually perform magic. More like what we're talking about now, in that this control mechanism and this secret mechanism to pass down information. If there is ether, you know what I mean? The theory of ether. That could be that middle section. Well, if there's again that control and that kind of operating system that's set up allows the influential people in those groups who tend to be the leaders of society to keep those whatever secrets they are within that, whether it be a
Right.
conspiracy to kill the president or to advance science in some way to where the end result gets out there and we make all the money off of it, but nobody else has that middle portion. You know what I mean? That's kind of what I was I
Well,
was getting at.
it's
That
very
ether is
interesting.
just, it's all bullshit. That's that ether they're guarding. That's
No.
the
Well,
ether. Everybody
it's
thinks this is all
very
real. It's not.
it's very interesting to me the extent to which you can take a look at how science has largely stalled out over the last 50 to maybe even 100 years. Let's say post World War II, it's largely stalled out and progress has been limited, except in those areas that are nearest and dearest to the technocratic agenda. I mean,
Hmm.
cybernetics, computer control, enormous progress. Things like life extension in biology and genetics, enormous progress. Fundamental developments in physics are pretty few and far between. And I think a lot of that is that fundamental developments like that would be very disruptive, very difficult to control, would have unforeseen consequences that could upset the apple cart. So there's a lot of incentive to try to limit undesired innovations that might threaten control. And I don't know, are you familiar with the story of Pergamon Press and Robert Maxwell?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't think so.
Um, he was Ghislaine Maxwell's father.
Right.
Oh,
And
right. Okay.
he, at one point, no one's quite sure where he got the money to do this, but he bought an outfit called Pergamon Press and started a proliferation of science journals until he got in the business. Peer review was largely unknown. In fact, Einstein went through his entire career and was only peer reviewed once. And when Einstein discovered that the editor of a journal had sent one of his papers out to an outside expert for a second opinion, he was so appalled and outraged, he withdrew the paper and published it elsewhere. So, peer review is a relatively new innovation in science.
And
Until,
it's treated like the gold standard,
oh yeah,
but
until,
also
Well, it depends on
it
who
could
you
feed
ask, and some people don't
right
care about peer review at all because they think all the peers are, I mean, I'm speaking about that from a
corrupt.
history perspective. Nobody wants to listen to historians because they think they're all making stuff up, including the peers who have reviewed and you've got your citations, they still think it's all made up. So
well, there were very
tough,
practical
tough
economic
crowd.
reasons for him to start pushing peer review. By creating a proliferation of journals, he couldn't find an expert editor with comprehensive familiarity with the broad subject matter of every one of these new journals.
Hmm.
So he developed instead this peer review system where you'd have a competent editor who may not necessarily know everything, but who would then send out all the papers to be reviewed for free by fellow scientists, and then look at the decisions that come back and make a decision on whether or not to publish or to make recommendations for changes based on the input from all of that peer review. And that's what allowed for a proliferation of journals, all of which had to be purchased by all the major research universities or institutions with a pretense of claiming to be a major research institution, and was enormously profitable. But a side effect of that is by making that a gateway, a clearinghouse for getting scientific work out there, it created centralization where you could identify novel ideas and suppress them. I mean, the process automatically is antithetical to true creativity, because
Hmm.
true creativity
Right.
is going to upset a lot of peers who aren't necessarily going to want to endorse your ideas. It really enhances and encourages minor incremental progress at the expense of stunningly novel originality that might upset or disturb everyone's careers and everyone's existing research programs and all the funding they're receiving, and so forth.
Well,
So there's
Hans, I wanted to ask you actually a question along those lines, and I'm not sure where we are in the part of getting all the things that you wanted to talk about. But when you first started talking, something came to mind to me along those lines I wanted to ask about is Uh, I've watched, or I think I listened to a podcast with this guy, Eric Weinstein. You familiar with him?
Mhm.
And I don't know where he fits in the pantheon of, he's onto something or he's not onto something. I don't follow a ton of physics, I'll be honest. But he spoke to something along the lines of what you did at the very beginning with this idea that physics was kind of stuck in this place, and for the exact reasons that you just outlined, where there's this sort of barrier and certain ideas can't get out because this core group is guarding
Right.
something, even if it doesn't work. And then he went on to attack string theory and talk about all the money that was being dumped into that and it doesn't work. And that was his perspective anyway. But could you speak a little bit to that? Maybe specifically about this idea of string theory, which is really popular, and where you stand on that. And then if anything, what you know about Weinstein and his credibility or incredibility. And I'm not a fan or not a fan, so I won't be offended either way.
Well, I think he raises some legitimate complaints about physics. There are any number of critics of string theory. It has not been a particularly productive uh, research area. There haven't been any great new novel predictions that have really proven their worth. I'm a little suspicious of Weinstein because he was also the architect of a UN report on, I'm trying to remember the title of it exactly, Immigration for the Benefit of All, where he laid out the economic case for mass migration from country to country, kind of an economic justification or rationalization for the kind of Kalergi plan mass migrations, into Europe and America. So, that kind of puts him on my list of suspicious characters.
Yeah, he seems to like to stir things up, and he's been on Rogan, he's been on some more serious, I say more serious podcasts than
Hey,
Rogan,
bro.
but um, but he's an economics guy as well, and he's at all the Ivy League schools and all
Right.
that kind of stuff. But he seemed, it's hard to tell when you listen to him because sometimes he's not super clear and he doesn't follow a singular path. He very quickly can jump off into something and use an analogy that leads him into a completely different topic. And it almost comes across like I think you're trying to maybe even deflect and jump to these other things because you don't want to sit too long on this point in case somebody asks too many questions.
Well,
But
he
I'm nowhere
has
near as smart as he is. He's certainly a smart guy just listening to him
Well,
talk.
he
But
has a similar mathematical model that he has worked on. I'm not really familiar with all the details of
is
it.
this the theory of everything that he's got or whatever he calls it, I
Yeah,
think.
I'm not sure what he calls it. I know he has presented and advocated a theory. I'm not aware that it has any particular other than novelty. It doesn't. I'm not aware of any particular advantage or conclusions or predictions that theory makes that are worthy of note. But I'm not terribly familiar with it, so I
Mhm.
can't really assess it.
All right. You got anything else for us, Hans? Is there anything you didn't touch on that you want? Because I'm still here. I know Daniel's got to go take care of a screaming baby here
Oh, I feel
shortly,
for you.
but
Well, let me briefly go. I think we skipped talking about Bernays and
yeah,
his role in
The
let's
all
do
this.
that.
sauce.
Yeah,
Tell us
Bernays
And
about the
sauce.
secret
I don't know
sauce.
how familiar you are with Bernays. If I should give a rundown of his.
Yeah, go ahead
Okay.
because it's interesting nonetheless, and it points with his connections to the kind of upper crust. It really points to this obscuring and propagandizing of narratives to a
Well, he's just a fascinating character. Once I learned about him, I read a couple of biographies, and he lived to I think over 100 years old. So, he
Figures.
kind of had the advantage of not only writing voluminously about himself, he was a public relations expert who his critics said throughout his career only had one client, himself. Shameless self-promoter, and
he's really kind of credited with like creating modern PR, right? I mean,
yeah, yes, he is.
There wasn't really a PR system until he kind of wrote it down and told you how to do it, right?
Right. He started his career as a theatrical promoter on Broadway, and one of his first triumphs was a producer wanted to produce a play called Damaged Goods, which was about a man with, I think, syphilis, sexually transmitted disease, having a child and passing the disease to the child. And the subject matter was, at the time, talking about sexually transmitted diseases was just not something you did in polite society. So no one would put the play on. Well, he made it a cause celeb and got an educational foundation set up and got support from Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and even a young FDR threw his weight behind this publicity campaign and ultimately got the play produced. And one contemporary newspaper editorial said that the play made it sex o'clock in America. So it had a pretty significant influence in promoting sexual openness if you are on Bernays' side, or contributing to the slide in moral and cultural standards if you're an opponent of his. But a lot
and
of
that
his
was far earlier than
This is 1913.
This is like crazy early for that kind of
Right.
Well, good or bad, it's early.
A lot of his publicity campaigns would have as a secondary goal, or as a flip side, he tended to pick things that also furthered his social or political goals. Now he was he went to a junior position in I think it's Committee for Public Information, the war propaganda group that was set up during World War I, and was very active in that. And after the war, he declared that the war had helped, I think the phrase was, open the eyes of the enlightened few to the possibilities of regimenting the public mind. And he set out to do that commercially and make money off of it through opening one of the first public relations offices. To give an example of one of his earliest feats, when he got married, he wanted to publicize the fact of his marriage. And ordinarily you'd put a notice in the New York Times or something like that. But what he did was he sent his wife to the Waldorf Astoria to register for the honeymoon suite under her maiden name. And there was much pearl clutching, and over 200 newspapers published articles about how what had standards come to in this august institution, allowing a woman to register for the honeymoon suite under her maiden name, and how unconventional this was. And the resulting publicity, it was really a trifecta for him. Not only did he get his wedding publicized and his name in the papers, he promoted the Waldorf Astoria, which was one of his clients, and he served the interest of promoting the feminist agenda and women's rights in America, one of his favored causes. He's credited with the art of the celebrity endorsement. In October of 1924, after the Broadway plays all closed Saturday night, he got a bunch of actors together on a train to come down and have a pancake breakfast with Calvin Coolidge Sunday morning. And the resulting publicity was credited with helping tip the balance in the 1924 election to Coolidge. He was a very relatively stiff character, and the pancake breakfast let them have headlines like Calvin Coolidge almost smiles, and you'll get his name in the paper as you're relating to all of these actresses and showing all these actors and entertainment celebrities were keeping cool with Coolidge, I think, was the campaign slogan. He is credited with contributing to getting women to smoke cigarettes. He sponsored a campaign where women smoked their torches of liberty up and down Fifth Avenue on Easter Sunday, which necessarily, you can imagine, got a fair bit of publicity. When one of his clients, Lucky Strike, complained that women still weren't buying a lot of their cigarettes, they did a survey and discovered women didn't like the green color that was used in the packaging. So Bernays said, well, that's easy. Change the color of your packaging. And Lucky Strike said, no, we've spent a lot of money on this packaging. You make women like green. So he took those orders and ran off and went to Paris and got the fashion houses, wheedled, cajoled, and bribed them to introduce green fashions, so that green was the thing for the next season. He even sponsored a green ball where all of the celebrities came dressed in green fashions to try to make green popular. I don't know how successful that one ultimately was, but it sure made a great story. One thing he did that was very successful was a bacon company wanted him to sell more bacon for them. So what he did was he put together an educational institute of doctors who announced that their research showed every day should start with a hearty breakfast. And what's that hearty breakfast going to have? It's going to have eggs and bacon. And that's something that's still part of American culture.
And before that, I mean, bacon was a throwaway cut. That was, I mean, any cured meat was the last thing that you ate. It took something that as a low profit margin, well, generally low. You sell it for low, but you get a lot of it, and it off of a pig, but it made it something that you had to have. It became a staple on everybody's table every morning.
Exactly.
That's
so he was responsible for that. Now, what I found that was kind of interesting when I was I stumbled into Bernays as I was researching Einstein, because after the great triumph of the 1919 eclipse and all of the controversy in Berlin, Einstein was looking to try to find a little more congenial place to hang out. So toward the end of 1920, he started making inquiries to American universities, trying to line up speaking engagements. He wanted to get paid something like $15,000 to do a speech or a lecture.
In 1920?
In 1920. Yeah, that's a lot of money at that time period. And he didn't get any takers willing to pay those prices. And planned on going to the Solvay conference in Belgium and hanging out, where he had the assistant professor, or the professorship at the University of Leiden in Belgium. But he had gotten involved in Zionist causes back after World War I, and got persuaded to accompany Chaim Weizmann, who was the head of the World Zionist Organization, to America for a fundraising tour to raise funds for the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So Einstein and Weizmann and the rest of the Zionist party showed up on board their ship to the docks of New York and were greeted by a screaming crowd of over 5,000 people. And reporters there, the crowd had been assembled due to all the publicity in the Jewish press, largely Eastern European and Russian Jews, who were many of whom had settled there in New York. And they had come to see Weizmann and the Zionist Party. But the non-Jewish reporters who were present, they hadn't heard of this Weizmann guy, but they had heard of Einstein. So they interpreted it as the crowd arriving to see Einstein. In fact, if you take a look at a pretty famous picture of the motorcade parade greeting Einstein, as the screaming crowds are lining the street and he's driving in the open car, you can see the crowds are actually, their attention is focused on the car behind Einstein, which is where Weizmann was. What was interesting, though, is there was a rift. There was a lot of tension in the American Jewish community at the time, because there was the well-established, assimilated Jews of English and German origin who had very senior positions in media and finance and in the mercantile businesses, and there was tension between them and the newcomer Eastern European Russian Jews that they kind of looked down upon. And while the more elite assimilated Jews were quite happy to make charitable contributions to support their brethren who were settling in Palestine, they weren't on board with the Zionist organization's scheme to create a Jewish state in Palestine. But that was exactly what Weitzman and all the publicity and the crowds were trying to publicize. So the New York Times, which was owned by a Jew, Adolf Ochs, they turned the publicity campaign and focused entirely on Einstein as a kind of to distract away from the Zionist mission that they didn't approve of. So that was one reason why Einstein got incessant publicity. Because they could claim the crowds that were coming out to see Weitzman as he stopped visiting various Jewish communities were really there to honor the famous scientist, and they weren't on board with this scheme about the Jewish state in Palestine.
Wow.
But what was really interesting to me is that whole event was exactly the kind of events and circumstances publicity that Bernays specialized. In fact, he coined that term of, you don't go and publicize your client by taking a reporter to lunch or begging an editor to print your press release. You create publicity by creating events and circumstances that demand coverage, which is exactly what 5,000 people, welcoming you on the dock is. That's an event that demands coverage. So I was wondering if Bernays was involved. And I was intrigued to discover in his memoirs that he acknowledged being a very close friend of Weitzman. In fact, if Bernays is to be believed, Weitzman offered him the position of foreign minister of the yet to be established Jewish state in Palestine. And I read later sources that acknowledged that Bernays had advised Weitzman. But nothing in the literature I was able to track down had any details on exactly what Bernays did for Weitzman. And I can guess that a lot of Bernays's clients were specifically those assimilated wealthy Jews who were in the mercantile industry, who were in the media business, that he interacted with professionally, who did not approve of Weitzman and what Weitzman was doing. So it's possible that he was just keeping that undercover and was involved with some of that publicity. But absent further evidence, we can't really know for sure exactly what Bernays did on Weitzman's behalf or what he advised him to do. But the publicity campaign that surrounded that visit and surrounded Weitzman's fundraising efforts in America has the hallmarks of a Bernays publicity campaign.
Wow.
Yeah, I've not even heard of this guy, and I'm surprised I hadn't, because he was listed in like Life magazine's 100 most influential people of the 20th century, and he was involved with the United Fruit Guatemala thing, which was Chiquita bananas and all that, like some crazy stuff. And apparently this is just like a quick skim of his Wikipedia page, but Sigmund Freud was his uncle. That's bizarre.
Yeah. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew. Yeah.
He was instrumental in publicizing Freud as well, and in getting the translation publicized. In fact, he's credited with I think someone had commented that he had Freud a household name in America at least 10 years before he would have been otherwise.
And I think some people connect Freud's knowledge of psychological whatever with Bernays's ability to kind of manipulate that part of people. What I mean?
Yeah, Bernays explicitly commented and acknowledged, his reliance on Freud's psychology. He also quoted and relied and was a student of Gustave Le Bon, who is a very famous French polymath. He actually did some work on relativity of all things, in addition to pioneering crowd psychology. If you're familiar with was it Matthias Desmet, who wrote a book on is it the psychology of mass delusion or mass formation or something along those lines, that got a fair bit of press during the COVID era. That's kind of a modern extension on Le Bon's theories of group psychology. And Bernays explicitly used that. He wrote a very good book, very short book. It's public domain. You can get it for free at archive.org, or I think there's a 99-cent Kindle edition on Amazon. Bernays's classic book, Propaganda, which is a relatively short, easy to read monogram. But that is kind of the founding document of the science of propaganda. It was relied on by Goebbels in the propaganda for the Nazi regime. And it's worth reading because it's only grown from there. One of the interesting things of looking at these 1920s era publicity campaigns is their heavy-handedness and how effective they were. As we have the benefit of having been overexposed to so many of those similar publicity type efforts that were a lot more skeptical, a lot more jaded than people were in the 1920s. So it's interesting to go back and look at those through our modern eyes and be better able to see how the manipulation was taking place.
Yeah, fascinating. Read through this guy's stuff. I did see this one line that people criticized him for being like Goebbels and Hitler, and he wrote in his autobiography that Goebbels read and used his books. Which would be interesting to read that, because if Bernays was true to himself, even if Goebbels hadn't, he probably would say that he did, because it would be still be promoting himself.
That's one of the things that mitigates against Bernays having been involved with the Weitzman campaign, because he was notoriously bad about keeping client confidences. He'd leak the to a friendly reporter, oh, how that got so popular last season. Well, that was my idea and I did it this way, and would take credit for things that perhaps were not entirely his own doing, or other publicity agents were involved in, but Bernays gladly took the full credit for it.
Yeah. Well, hey, Hans, this has been a great conversation. Fascinating. I learned a whole lot, and a lot of stuff I didn't know, connections I hadn't made before. So thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Did you want to tell people more about like your website and mention your Substack again? I know you got some books if you wanted to mention any of that stuff.
Oh, sure. My current leading project is my Fields into Energy. It's going to be a 3-book series. The overall series subtitle was going to be How Electromagnetism and Quantum Mechanics Work and Where Physics Went Wrong. But it grew beyond the bounds of the 550 pages, which is the maximum limit you can have a hardcover through Amazon Kindle publishing. So it's going to end up being 3 volumes. Book 1 will hopefully be out this summer on the fundamentals and origin of electromagnetism. Book 2 is going to be on where physics went wrong, and will cover a lot of what we've been discussing about relativity and Einstein and modern physics and quantum mechanics. And then book 3 will be how electromagnetism and quantum mechanics work. On my Substack, which you'll find at etherczar.substack.com, and I spell it AETHERCZAR.substack.com. I'm serializing Fields and Energy. The contents of book 1 are already there and posted. I'm most of the way through book 2, and again, a lot of the material on on Einstein and relativity and Jewish physics and some of these related topics and Bernays. That's all already on the Substack, and you can read those if you're interested in learning more. In addition to my work on fields and energy, I wrote a textbook on ultra wideband antennas, the art and science of ultra wideband antennas. My fictional works include a series of alternate history, conspiracy techno thrillers, The Hidden Truth.
Yeah, one of those were bestsellers, right?
They sold quite well.
Yeah.
I still have to finish the final volume of it.
Oh, but don't Game of Thrones this, man. Finish it.
I've been distracted by well, I mean, I started writing those as a way of conveying my physics ideas through science fiction, and I finally decided I may as well just write fields and energy to explain what I wanted to do and do it in a nonfiction format. But it's about the inciting incident is the high school protagonist discovers a dusty book in his forgotten Appalachian hometown library where the text of the book does not agree with the online scans purportedly of that book. And that's the incident that sets him off on the course of discovering the cabal behind the scenes that is attempting to change the past so that they can control the present and rule the future. So that's
what I was saying.
You're using too many keywords that are going to get Ernie all excited before bedtime. Cabal and conspiracy and
well, it's kind of ironic. When I wrote the first book, it was a bit in tongue in cheek. I'm going to write about the conspiracy that the people who think they're conspiracy theorists don't know about, that's really pulling the strings on all those other conspiracies that they are familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And but then as I got into book 2 and 3, it was becoming increasingly obvious to me that a lot of the stuff I was writing about was very real, and I worked a lot of those elements into the successive books. Book 2, A Rambling Wreck, the hero goes off to Georgia Tech and thwarts a social justice conspiracy takeover of the school. And in book 3, the hero has a summer internship where he goes to Jekyll Island to try to disrupt the summer conference that the evil cabal is
Come on.
Mm-hmm.
Come on.
Now, my most recent novel is The Whys of Heart. It is a modern day retelling of the Scopes monkey trial. So what I did is basically update the Scopes monkey trial for the 21st century by replacing evolution with transgenderism. And it describes a fictional law forbidding the teaching of any theory of biological sex that defies anyone's gender identity, and then follows the same template as the events of the Scopes trial that you may have seen in Inherit the Wind, but bringing it up to date for modern events in a modern audience.
Cool. So
very cool. I'm also involved in the independent indie authors scene, and I started the basedbooksale.substack.com, where we all get together and put books on sale for 99 cents a few times a year. And if you're interested in reading red pill, unconventional based science fiction and fantasy, that's a good place to go to get some really good bargains from both well-established and emerging authors.
Awesome.
Cool.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, man. I can't thank you enough for being willing to talk to a dummy like me. I don't understand all of it, but it's right in there. It was really cool conversation. I can't thank you enough.
Well, my pleasure. It's a pleasure. I appreciate you letting me share your forum with you and talk to your audience. And happy to come back sometime if there's more you'd like to discuss.
Yep, I got your email address. We'll bring you back, and I'm gonna keep reading your Substack because Lord knows I've never read anything scientific that I've been able to,
get your scientific dictionary out. Don't hurt yourself.
All right, guys. Well, this is it. We'll be back next week. I think we're gonna do part 2 of uh Dan, Dan Duke, the great grandson of Jesse James. So
Oh,
that'll
wow.
be
Right on.
yeah, we talked to him for about 3 hours last week, and it was mind blowing. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to comment. I haven't had a chance to listen to all of your back catalog yet, but I really enjoyed the episode with Blaine Pardoe. I
Right.
met him at BasedCon
Oh,
last
cool.
year, and I was familiar with him in the context of his work in doing kind of military thrillers.
Yeah.
And I really liked his new series he's doing with Mike Barron, Tenure, which I think is excellent. They've got 2 books in that series. So far. I had no idea he was into true crime and crime investigations, but that was a very fascinating story.
He tackled a weird one, man. I mean, that was the boogeyman in my hometown my whole life. So it was cool.
So thank you guys for sharing that. It was fascinating.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.
And I'll throw your Substack and stuff like that in the show notes. And yeah, just holler at people if they want to listen to some mildly Virginia-based conspiracy or hidden history that we're out here.
Okay. I will certainly do my best to publicize it.
All right, man. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
Good night.
Hey, Danny the Manny.
Yep.
Oh, I'm still recording. I forgot how to stop recording. How do I do this? Thought I hit record and then no, I'm already okay.
Well, you figure that out. I'll call you in a few minutes. Let me go get Flora to bed and make sure the boys are down, and I'll call you. All right.
All right. Later, brother. Okay. It used to have a thing that said stop recording, and now it doesn't anymore. I'm confused. All right. Well, I'm just gonna close the meeting down. It should send me the thing. So have a good night, man.
Good night. Thanks again.
All right, bye.